Okay, thank you very much. As we've seen so far today, and I guess especially in this area, there are almost more questions than we have answers. So at least the least thing I want to do is to speak with you about some questions that we have, some challenges that we also see. Before doing that, I thought, being amongst friends, I can start with a small confession. The problem of the waste of food. We hear a lot about it. There are a lot of campaigns about it in the UK, but also where I live, in the Netherlands. And not only as working for PepsiCo, but also as a father of 3 children growing up, seeing all these advertisements about throwing away food, my first reaction was, who are these people? Buying food which has been grown, which has been produced, has been transported, they cook it, and then finally they throw it away. Well, looking a little bit closer, I'm afraid I was one of them, and I'm still one of them, and I guess that counts for everybody. My only main take out for this was that there are a lot of things as a consumer which tend to skip in your habits, and unless you are being held, unless you are confronted with it, you stop thinking about it, you won't change it. And I think that's the essence of consumer communication. And that's why I wanted to share some of the challenges that we see. Like already was said, I work for PepsiCo International, but besides that I'm also chairman of the UNESTA working group, environmental working group, and this is one of the topics which is very high in our agenda. Before going into the details, just 2 slides on PepsiCo, because the first thing that people think about talking about PepsiCo is one of our major brands, and that's Pepsi Cola. However, PepsiCo is the 2nd food and beverage company worldwide. We're active in more than 200 companies. We almost have 200,000 employees working for us, and we're active not only in the beverage, but also in the juices, in the cereals, and in the snacks business. So it's a broader-based food and beverage company. About UNESTA, we're part of UNESTA. UNESTA is the organization, association for the beverage industry, for the non-alcoholic beverage industry in Europe. The members are soft drink companies as well as member national associations. And the market, some 123 billion liters per year. I must say I saw the number and I have no clue if you would all add it together how much that is, but I can tell you it's a lot. About the environment, we'll get back to that a little bit later. If you take a step back and you look at sustainable consumption and production and where we are right now, which is, and I think many people will have the same feeling, that if you look to the landscape on European level, we see a lot of different initiatives. We see a lot of different initiatives on member state level, with different logos, with different footprinting exercises, different emphasis. It's only carbon or it's broader about emissions. We see on the European level a lot of different initiatives. The European Commission, who's commissioning a study, but also the Retailer Forum and the SCP, Sustainable Consumption and Production Food Roundtable, which is a joint effort between industry and the European Commission, on which, by the way, methodology development and communication both are very high on the agenda. And also one step higher, also on global level. We see the Consumer Goods Forum and we see the World Business Council of Sustainable Development. And on each of the agendas, you see exactly the same questions coming back. How do we measure environmental footprints of products? And secondly, how do we communicate with consumers? And maybe instead of communicating with consumers, we should talk about how do we engage consumers in this area. Alignment, therefore, is absolutely needed. And I also think that everybody will agree with that. Why? We are running the risk of proliferation. And the risk of proliferation, and I will make some more comments and I will compare it to some of the developments that we have seen also in the health and wellness debate, where we have a lot of different ways of communicating with consumers about the health impact of what they eat, about healthy behaviors, etc. And we know that consumer confusion is around the corner. And we know that the more different messages consumers get, the sooner they will get lost. And if they get lost, they will reconnect and you don't get them back very easily. So first of all, let's prevent consumer confusion. Secondly, also looking from a company perspective, we are, for instance, producing in one country for 6 different markets. And our products go all over the markets and also upward supply chain. We work with companies and suppliers in a lot of different countries. If we would end up with different systems in different member states, that would have a huge impact on our supply chain. And I can guarantee you all the extra costs we have to put in that to comply with that, it will be a waste, because we'd rather use that to lower our environmental footprint, because at the end of the day, that's what our objective is. So back to UNESA, what we say. We acknowledge the fact, and we know also from all the consumer research we do, is that there is a growing need with consumers to get information, environmental information. They want more information, however, and we also discussed it in one of the sessions we had earlier today, consumers do have a tendency to say, well, the more information you can give me, the better it is. But at the end of the day, if you really look what they are using and how they are using it, it depends very much. We do know also for consumer information that it needs global alignment, and also there is not one size fits all. There's not one silver bullet. We have different target groups, different interests of consumers, and we need to, like we do in brand communication, also in environmental communication, we need to acknowledge that. Secondly, also the consumer information, it needs to be credible, and it needs to be relevant, impactful, and it needs to be objective. And finally, there are many ways of informing consumers. So instead of talking about labeling, I think we need to put the consumer information at the heart of the discussion, which means labeling can be one of the means, can be one of the instruments that you use, but it should be one of the possibilities in a total mix of way how to reach to consumers. The guiding principle of which we are working in our work stream is that so basically we want to do the right thing, and the right thing from two angles. First of all, from a consumer angle, so what is actionable, what fits within the consumer framework, and secondly also what is relevant and the right thing from an environmental perspective. If you look to the challenge, and I won't go deep into the method, into the details, but basically I think that yes, there are a lot of challenges about methodology development, but in all honesty, I think we can get that sorted out. If you look to carbon, we're working on a global level with the beverage industry environmental roundtable, together with the alcoholic and a non-alcoholic beverage. We've made a greenhouse gas protocol also based on the PAS 2050, which is now being verified by the World Business Council Sustainable Development and WRI. It will be integrated somewhere, or at least aligned with ISO, so I think basically we will get there. We have challenges when it comes to other environmental impacts, but also that I think it's manageable, it's doable. What really is concerning is the speed of the developments at this moment. And I know there has been some presentations about what's happening in France. I think what's happening in France really sets a precedent. And on one way, that's absolutely a good thing, because it really speeds up the process. On the other way, we need to be sure that we're doing the right thing, because it will have an implication worldwide. And then finally, what I found looking at it from more a communication perspective is that when we talk about communication, we tend to talk more about how to communicate instead of what we want to achieve with the consumers. So if we want to zoom a little bit more into that one. If you look now broadly from a big perspective to what we see and the different initiatives we see in Europe, basically you see 4 different kind of objectives. You see some systems which are very much aimed at influencing the consumption phase, so for instance recycling logos, but also advise not to throw away food, so prevent food waste. We see initiatives in which we say, well, we want to have informed category choice, so there are consumer campaigns from governments and NGOs against bottled water, against meat, so that kind of campaigns in which you say, well, you want to guide consumers in the choices they make. There are brand and company commitments, and I think the work that's being done with the Carbon Trust and also the carbon reduction logo is a clear example of that. Companies committing to lower their environmental footprint, but also there are other elements in it, like a fair trade logo. And finally, we see also sometimes discussion about product comparison. So I have 2 identical products, and which one has the highest or the lowest number than the other one. Without saying which one is better or worse, I think that are basically the 4 main categories of types of information that we see. So how do we structure that? First of all, let's take one step back and look to the broader context. And carbon allowances, like we do in GDA, is sometimes being discussed, and I know it's very difficult, but if you look to an individual consumer footprint, you know where you, at the end of the day you want to come out, maybe it's somewhere around to 20,000 kilograms CO2 per day. So the big question for us, and I don't have the answer, is If you compare two identical products, and let's take, yes, the comparison between Pepsi and Coke, suppose you have 170 grams CO2 content in a can of beverages. What difference is significant? So if you go out to the consumer and ask them to compare these two, make their choice based on the amount of carbon, what amount is significant? And how much is it also related to the overall environmental footprint of a consumer? Because the last thing we want to do is to educate consumers to make choices based on information, and 2 years from now, they start to figure out to say, well, the overall impact is not that high, and then we also get, we will also lose them. So if you take that step back and we put the consumer at the heart of the discussion, I think there are two ways. If you look to a product carbon footprint, there's one part which is very much upstream, and that's our responsibility as a company. We have the responsibility to work with our suppliers, to work with our farmers, to work with our packaging producers, to work with our transporters in order to lower our environmental emission. And that is the core and the most important reason for doing product carbon footprinting or product environmental footprints. However, there's also a big part upstream, you know it, it's the consumer itself. It's about packaging, recycling, food waste, transport, cooling, preparation, use, and you can make the list even longer. The big question, I think, and that is also where we need these footprints for, is how do you weigh these things? There are some products in which the production phase has a huge impact, and there are some products in which the consumption phase has a huge impact. So that means that also has a different rationale or a different implications for the consumer communication. If you do these assessments, and if you go through this assessment, you might ask yourself, what do we want the consumers to do? Because at the end of the day, what is sustainable consumption looking like? Because that's where I want to focus on. And this is not our definition of it, but just some things to make us think. So what do we want to achieve with the consumers? For instance, do we want them to go to the shop once a week instead of every day? Or take the bike to go to the shop or instead of the car? Do we want the consumers to make a conscious choice between products and categories? Do we want consumers to buy the right quantity? Do we want consumers that they know how to best store and cook the products? And I think the potato example of this morning, I think it was excellent, which shows clearly that in some products the consumer does have a huge impact. Do we want consumers to recycle packaging, etc.? We need to define that, and you might need to define that on a product category level. But because at the end of the day, you will need to find ways to guide the consumer with relevant environmental consumer communication. To give you an example from our own sector, we know that there are sometimes consumers buying chilled products. At the end of the day, they put it in their bag and they start consuming it when it's already heated up. So why buy a chilled product which has an environmental impact, while at the end of the day you're not drinking the chilled product? So we also know from our product analysis that we've done that especially the recycling of a beverage packaging has a huge impact. So we know that if we want the consumers to do something, we would ask him to recycle the packaging and maybe put more emphasis on that. So also in terms of thinking, we believe that if you look to environmental communication, we need to focus on the most relevant elements. And that depends very much on the overall impact and where the impact in the total supply chain is of consumers. So for instance, is the impact on the overall footprint of a consumer, is it high? Then I can imagine that to stimulate informed choices, to make them understand what the implications are of choosing meat above chicken or dairy products or soft drinks or juices, what the total impact is on their overall footprint. If it's low, you can think about or to the relative impact of the consumer phase. If the impact of the consumer phase is very high, then I think it's more relevant to focus on topics that are actionable for the consumer, how he can use the product, he or she can use the product, and give him or her instructions for the use or disposal of the product. And finally, there's a final piece and part on it which shows clearly a brand or a company environmental commitment. So how do these things come together? I think that if you look to communication, we need to think about different layers of communication. I think it starts with more general, creating awareness, about, for instance, reducing food waste, recycling of packaging, but also creating the social context that we talked about this morning. That is something which is sometimes more general information, not directly brand or individual product related. The second bit could be about getting consumers some understanding about what is the impact of various categories on your own personal environmental footprint. The third big piece is about preparation, handling and storage, and the fourth big piece is about brand or company commitment, which I think still remains important. And we discussed it a little bit earlier in one of the sessions as well. I truly believe that the commitment to reduce your footprint is going to be part of your brand value. Consumers expect it. Our most valuable asset we have, that is the trust that consumers have in our brands. And part of that trust will become, if it's not already there, but it at least will become also what we are doing in terms of ethical supply, in terms of lowering our environmental footprints. So giving that commitment as a brand or a company, I truly believe it stays important. Looking at this, I also think that we need to be aware of the fact, and we need to understand and also accept the fact that we will need to work with many different organizations in this, because consistency in your messaging is key. Like I said, if I compare it with the health and wellness discussion we've had, a lot of claims have been made by companies in the past, and consumers are getting confused. A lot of mixed messages they get from science, from governments, from companies, and consumers get confused. And I think we're in a stage where we can prevent that from happening. That means that governments, NGOs, trade organizations, and absolutely don't want to forget the media, and especially not after the presentation of the previous speaker, and companies will need to work together. And we also need to acknowledge the fact that each of the actors might have a bigger impact or might have a bigger role in various different ways of communicating. So finally, I think the road ahead, like I said, we don't have all the solutions yet. We're working on this. We're working on this within the World Business Council of Sustainable Development. We're working on this in UNESTA, within the SCP Food Roundtable, which is co-chaired by the industry and European Commission. My plea would absolutely be, let's put the consumer at the heart of the discussion. And you can make a comparison. We sometimes tend to try to make experts of consumers. It's like if you want to sell a car, there's a whole list of technical details which are all showing that that car is perfect. But that list of technical details will not sell the car. It's the same with consumption or sustainable lifestyle, sustainable consumption. All the facts in itself won't change the lifestyles of consumers. So if we want to reach them, we have to put them in the center. We have to minimize our amount of messages and really aim for the 80-20 rule. So what are the few things that the consumer can do which have the biggest impact on his personal footprint? That's what we mean with let's focus on the right thing. It's relevant for consumers and it targets the right things. And thirdly, I think let's align. Let's align between different parties, but also let's align internationally between the different initiatives. So basically, that are the messages I wanted to leave here for this afternoon. I'm more than happy to take any questions that you might have.